Okay. Again, the title of this presentation is Spiritual Care During a Global Pandemic. Spiritual care during a global pandemic. First and foremost, it is important as we have this discussion to talk about bad theology versus good theology during a global pandemic. Bad theology versus good theology during a global pandemic. I'm going to be sharing several slides with you during this time. I want you to direct your attention to slide number 1. When we think about good theology versus bad theology during a global pandemic or health crisis, there are what we call particular types of responses to illness that speak to a person's theological beliefs. One type of response to illness, such as COVID-19, is that this illness is a punishment from the divine. Whoever, whatever you name that divine, God, Allah, Buddha, Yahweh. There are some people who believe that punishment is indicative of one who has sinned, and thus now COVID-19 becomes the punishment or health crisis that one must experience. Thereby, the only dynamic that one can engage in to be fully healed, if you will, from this virus is to repent from sinful lifestyles or behaviors and reconnect or reestablish one's relationship with the divine. This is a very unhealthy, inaccurate, and inappropriate theological belief in response to COVID-19. And I am deeply saddened when I see clergy and other faith leaders lift up and highlight this particular theological belief. This is very unhealthy, and first and foremost, it is inaccurate. And it is this type of theological belief that you may hear pastors preach from the pulpit. It is this type of theological belief that you may see go viral on social media, such as Facebook or Twitter. And so my invitation to faith leaders is we must reject this type of theological belief. Whenever we see friends or family regurgitating this type of theological belief in response to COVID-19, we must hold up our hand and say, stop. No, this is inappropriate. This would presuppose, if I was following this line of thought, that everybody who unfortunately had contracted COVID-19 has been sinful. And can we honestly say that's the truth? Can we honestly say that that's accurate? Can you honestly, as you reflect, say that everybody you know, to date, there has been over 100,000 people who have unfortunately died as a result of COVID-19. Can we say that all of those persons who unfortunately passed away were sinful? No, we cannot. We cannot say that. And so we must reject this type of theology, and we must put up a red flag and say stop when we hear persons reiterating this negative, inappropriate theology. We must also, during this time, think about the second type of theological belief that exists during COVID-19 or a type of illness, is that illness is a test from the divine. And in some sense, the one who is ill in Christian communities or in Christian circles is ill because they are a present day biblical Job or Jobette. If you are Christian, this type of theological stance is also lifted up. in many Christian circles. There is a belief that we use the story of Job in present day form to tell people, similar to the historical narrative of Job, that God is gambling on you, on me, on us, and we are pawns in a wager that God has made with, quote unquote, the devil. For those who are not familiar with this story of Job, we highlight chapters 1 and 2 of the story of Job, which suggests that, the devil was roaming the earth, quote unquote, and God all of a sudden stops the devil and says, "What are you doing?" And the devil says, "I'm looking for someone to tempt." And God says, "Well, have you considered my servant Job?" And then God and the devil engage in a back and forth. And ultimately, the devil says, "Well, allow me, God, to put him to the test. And you'll discover that he will no longer acknowledge you as his God if you allow me to let him experience various types of difficult and painful calamities." And so God says, "Okay, great." And so in some sense, this story has been interpreted unethically to many people today in light of COVID-19 to suggest that, if you or I contract the virus, we must not question God. We must not become angry with God because we are pawns in a wager that God is making with the devil. Therefore, we must always exhibit peacefulness, joyfulness, powerfulness in the midst of this quote unquote test. And we began to say, just like believing that illness is a punishment from the divine, that this theological belief is inaccurate and unhealthy and inappropriate and not pastoral. We say the same of this type of theological belief that illness is a test from the divine. This also is an unhealthy, inappropriate, inaccurate, and very just non-pastoral response. But you will be amazed at the number of clergy that also preach this type of theological belief from behind the sacred desk. And so we say, you must also challenge clergy, family, friends, colleagues, and also, again, put up your hand and say, no, we cannot highlight this inappropriate theological belief. There are a few people who believe a third perspective, that illness is no implication of one's relationship with God. That, you know what, sometimes life just stinks. Things happen that have nothing to do with our relationship with a higher presence. Our role is none of the above. Our role as clergy, as spiritual care providers, as chaplains, is to exhibit what we call an understanding that the divine is with you during crisis. This is a healthy, accurate theological response to crisis. I'm going to pause for a second before I move on to the next section of this presentation and ask, does anyone have any quick questions or comments before I move forward? Okay, let's move forward. And so the first tip, if you will, of providing spiritual care during a global pandemic, the first point that I would invite you all to remember is to challenge unhealthy, inappropriate theological constructs and beliefs that are not helpful to helping persons currently grapple with COVID-19. That is our first task in our response to providing spiritual care. The second task is this. My second slide. That we want to highlight is we must address food insecurity. We must address food insecurity. Now, there are some people that say, well, Reverend, how is that a part of spiritual care? My spiritual care approach that I believe, that I highlight, is that spiritual care is more than simply catering to the faith or religious needs of persons. But my spiritual care approach that I suggest we all become on board with is also ministering to the social needs of persons, the social needs of persons. And so what is the largest social need plaguing most persons impacted by COVID-19? We've discovered that that is food insecurity. During this global pandemic, many persons unfortunately do not have access to food, healthy food, if you will. According to, I'm going to give you a website, www.feedingamerica.org. Again, that's www.feedingamerica.org. New statistics now are showing that particular occupational categories experience food insecurity compared to others. Take a look at this graph I have on your screen. Again, you can obtain this from feedingamerica.org. You would notice that particular occupations have a higher rate of food insecurity rather than others. I wonder, what's your thoughts when you see this? What are themes that immediately jump out in your mind as you look at these particular occupational categories? One thing that should jump out at you is understanding that a majority of the population would be centered in construction, production, installation, maintenance, repair, sales, service, office, and administrative support. According to Feeding America, most persons in these occupational categories, most persons who live in our larger society today would weigh heavy towards the professions you see listed on the right side of the graph. Many persons, the persons in higher socioeconomic statuses, would weigh in on the left side of the graph. Now, why is it important to highlight that? According to feedingamerica.org, it's so important to highlight this because in some sense, this graph is explaining to us statistical data that suggests that if the majority of our population is on the right side of this graph, then this would mean that the majority of our population struggles with access to healthy and adequate food right now during this virus. I'm going to put up a second slide or graph for you. This figure too, according to feedingamerica.org, suggests that there's also a breakdown in particular industry categories by food insecurity rate. I'll give you a moment to examine that. Again, according to Feeding America, most of the American population find themselves in industrial work leaning towards the right side of our graph, which means, following this statistic, again, the majority of our American population, particularly in the United States, struggles with food insecurity. These rates are alarming. I want to ask a reflective question for you to just jot down in your notes this morning. Can you imagine what it would be like to not only contract COVID-19 or have a close loved one contract COVID-19, and at the same time, you are also experiencing food insecurity, hunger? We say that in a global pandemic, first things first, we have to look at the intersectionality of oppression. The intersectionality of oppression. Oftentimes, people are not victims to one type of oppression. Oftentimes, persons are victims to a multitude of oppressions at the same time. And so COVID-19 has some startling impacts for particular people. And primarily, we say right now, those who do not have access to healthy food. We even experience a breakdown of these numbers per state, according to Feeding America. In our country alone, there is ways in which Feeding America has projected food insecurity from 2020 on right now into the future versus what it was in 2018. And these are the particular states that we say struggle with food insecurity the most right now. Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, Nevada, and Kentucky. Now, the irony in this conversation is if you look at the graph towards the right of your screen, you will see that many of these states had much different statistical numbers 2 years ago in 2018. Whereas I'm going to draw your attention to Nevada. Nevada ranks as 8 today in 2020 for food insecurity. But 2 years ago, they ranked as number 20, which means we like to say in 2020, the state that has been impacted the most in the last 2 years by food insecurity at an alarming or growing rate is the state of Nevada compared to all of the other states that you see listed here on today. So now, the question for us becomes, what can we do? What are we called to do as clergy, as people of faith, in light of this systemic social need? Well, I have 3 recommendations. Not only is spiritual care during the global pandemic of COVID-19 encompassing us addressing bad theology, but we're also called to address social needs of our brothers and sisters in our society today by, number 1, supporting local food banks. I invite clergy to do a community needs assessment of the particular neighborhood of their faith community, as well as your own personal your own personal neighborhood, if you do not live in the same neighborhood as your faith community, and begin to discover and learn where are the available food banks, soup kitchens, food pantries in your neighborhood. And how do we begin to disseminate this information more and more? So there are some people who use social media in very courageous and prophetic ways to distribute or make viral handouts that show, this particular location is a wonderful location that is currently doing food distribution, so that we can begin to get the word out. Other churches, other clergy participate in knocking on doors, going door to door to get the word out that this particular location in the neighborhood is currently disseminating free food. We also want you to be able to highlight various organizations throughout the city that work towards challenging food insecurity. The #1 organization here in the Chicago area, if you live here in the Chicago or greater Chicagoland area, the #1 social service organization that we direct people to is entitled A Just Harvest. A Just Harvest. A Just Harvest. This particular organization is located in the Rogers Park neighborhood. They are known as the city's premier social service organization that addresses food insecurity. They operate a food pantry that's open at various times during the week, and they also take in food donations, as well as they make mobile deliveries from time to time to people in various parts of the city. So we invite you to check them out. #2, we as clergy, as community of faith, are called to start our own faith community food shelters or food pantries. You may notice that some churches are now operating pop-up shops, if you will, where there's a particular day of the week that we say persons can come to this particular faith community and receive free food. Maybe your faith community is doing something like that. I'm going to invite you to share in our chat, in the Q&A forum, if you or your faith community leads a social service food pantry or food program that you want to get the word out about for other people to attend or at least donate to. We're going to ask that you drop that information in our Q&A or chat box. Maybe this presentation is inspiring you to create, to facilitate, to develop a food pantry in your own faith community right now. Again, this is something so simple to do, yet we think that this is hard, but it's so simple to support doing maybe a weekly food giveaway, food pantry, where we create flyers, get the word out that we're doing this, and have people come to the church to receive these services. Last but not least, #3, we invite persons to support legislation and politics that support access to healthy food markets, particularly in underdepressed or underserved communities. If you were to go to McDonald's.com website, you would discover that per zip code, there are more fast food restaurant chains like McDonald's established in underserved, economically depressed Black and Brown communities as opposed to other communities. And so we have to begin to challenge our politicians locally, challenge our aldermen, our alderwomen, our council, our mayor, our governors to say, let us stop constantly giving funding and allocating space for fast food restaurants and chains in poor communities of color, and more so advocate for funding for fresh produce markets. And so we do believe that policy and legislation change is at the heart of this conversation to address food insecurity as well. Before I move on to my next point, I'm going to pause and find out if there are any particular questions or comments you want to make about food insecurity in light of COVID-19. Thank you for those who are dropping information in the Q&A in the chat. I think you're on mute. I'm sorry, I think
just wanted to say that we'll share this. I'll share this in the email, any information that's shared in the chat, because this is, really what it's about, to be inspired and to get information about what people are doing within their communities, because there is a lot of great things going on.
Yeah. Yes, yes. I think someone else was jumping in and say something. Feel free to unmute yourself if you had something you wanted to jump in and say. Okay. The third important dynamic to remember in our spiritual care approach is, in addition to providing sound, appropriate, accurate theology, in addition to catering to the social needs of persons during this global pandemic, particularly around issues of food insecurity, we have to also be sensitive to the emotional needs that persons have right now. According to a Christian counselor by the name of Gloria Wilcox, last name is spelled Willcox, Willcox. Many people experience a number of feelings during times of crisis. There are 6 major feelings that all people experience: sad, mad, scared, peaceful, joyful, powerful. Sad, mad, scared, peaceful, joyful, powerful. And she suggests, particularly during a crisis, many people experience sad, mad, and scared. Now, our job as spiritual care providers is to journey with people, again, reminding people that the divine is with them during this difficult time. At the same time, we're also experiencing that persons during a global pandemic like COVID-19 now unearth different various types of psychological struggles and oppressions. Let me say more about that. Let me explain that. There is a psychological perspective by a famous African-centered psychologist by the name of Nancy Boyd Franklin in her book, Black Families in Therapy. Black Families in Therapy by Nancy Boyd Franklin suggests that whenever persons experience a crisis, people never approach that crisis through a current lens of feelings. But in some sense, people now carry into this crisis deep-seated, unaddressed emotional concerns and bring that into this new crisis as well. I hope that wasn't confusing the way I explained that. Let me give you an example. Whenever I hear of someone who has recently passed away, I not only grapple with my current feelings of grief around this current loss, but I also now am triggered to now remember and think about and reflect on various other previous experiences of other persons who have died in my life. Nancy Boyd Franklin says this is actually a psychological phenomenon that exists in everyone. When we began to think about the impact of COVID-19 and the grief and the loss around this particular current event, we become triggered by also reflecting on the impact of previous grieving or grief-stricken life events. In some sense, that is what's called a trigger. And so there are many psychological therapists and counselors today who suggest that we need to begin to think about long-term professional counseling and therapy after a pandemic, or sometimes even during a pandemic. And so, in addition to ministering to the faith or religious needs by promoting good, sound theology, in addition to catering to the social needs, like addressing food insecurity, I propose that we also minister to the emotional needs that many persons experience today, and primarily make referrals to psychological counseling references that persons can highlight. What are some websites that you can highlight for persons today? The first website that I encourage you to highlight is from the American Psychological Association, psychologytoday.com. www.psychologytoday.com. psychologytoday.com. psychologytoday.com. You can go to this website. You can go to this website. You can type in your zip code, and therapists in your zip code will then populate that and be listed as references or resources whom you can call. And so we invite clergy leaders to share this website. When you are having your Zoom worship service, we invite you to highlight this website and say, hey, we're sensitive to the emotional needs of our faith community members today. And here is a website that you can check out. For persons, for African-American persons in particular, there is a belief that African-American persons in particular also wrestle with emotional needs that are compounded by, today, police brutality. There's an understanding that, again, in looking at the intersections of oppression, what makes COVID-19 difficult for African-American persons in particular is also wrestling with the trauma of now dealing with watching George Floyd be killed, or hearing stories about Breonna Taylor being killed, right? And so there are particular resources for African Americans in particular to hash out what we say is psychological or emotional trauma that African Americans deal with, not only in light of COVID-19, but police brutality that occurs during COVID-19 as well. And so I'm going to direct your attention to checking out these particular websites and resources that you could share with persons of color during this time. www.blacktherapисtrock.com, www.therapyforblackgirls.com, and www.melaninandmentalhealth.com. We say that it is so important to examine and not take lightly the emotional needs that persons experience during a pandemic, because emotional needs trigger physical concerns in the body. I'll say that again. Emotional needs trigger physical concerns in the body. What are you talking about? Reverend Danielle, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that particular question. I am going to post a graph that begins to highlight for you the ways in which emotional needs impact physical ailments. This graph begins to talk about the ways in which emotional energy impacts particular centers of the body. Of all my slides, this is like my favorite slide. We began to see that in light of COVID-19, in light of this pandemic, the ways in which we begin to have psychological or psychosocial or emotional concerns now contributes to physical ailments that actually show up in our body. Let me give you an example. Did you know, I'm going to push you to looking at the heart center. Did you know that people who struggle now with grieving and sorrow and sadness, and grief, sorrow, sadness, and loss around multiple deaths that have occurred as a result of COVID-19, actually now begin to have different heart ailments, such as congestive heart failure or heart attacks or various other issues related to the heart. And so as spiritual care providers, we have to, again, direct people to long-term psychological counseling for these deep-seated emotional needs. And at the same time, journey with them as they begin to process everything you see in the black on this chart under heart center: emptiness, lack of love, helplessness, aloneness, disillusionment, embarrassment, shame, humiliation, repressed feelings, disappointment, cruelty, meanness. In some sense, we've never paid attention to the ideology or belief that what you struggle with emotionally then can have devastating effects on you physically. But this graph begins to highlight the importance of that. And so when people are struggling because of COVID-19 with various emotional needs, we actually see them presenting to hospitals now with these various types of physical ailments. I'll pause for a moment to entertain any thoughts or questions that you might have on this. Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump right in.
Having recently lost my wife, I understand the heart problems. I also understand the need to go very soon. After that, I was diagnosed with gout, and then with high blood pressure and all kinds of things. So, my eating practices from McDonald's and so forth didn't assist that process at all. So I also have what they call it diabetes number 2. And so I sense that you've made a point that to me makes it's abundantly clear that those people who are in emotional or law and the isolation patterns that we're into right now do not help that process at all.
You're right. You're right.
So you have to reach out.
You're right.
I have to go out. I have to ask for help.
Thank you, Bill. I want to say thank you so much, Bill, for sharing, and we're sending much love and light to you in these moments. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
This is Martha Childress. Is there a way that I can obtain a copy of this chart?
Yes. Let me say that this will be made available to you when this presentation is over, number one. Number two, let me say you can just go to google.com and you can just type in this title and click on images. You go to google.com, you type in this title, Emotional Energy Centers of the Body, and then click on your Google where it says images. You'll see something that says you want to click on images, and then you'll see this image pop up. It's highly circulated on the internet. I'm sorry, you will also find out who is the creator of this. I'm sorry, I don't have that information at this time. It slips my mind.
Danielle, this is Jake. I'm wondering if you might have journal articles that you would point our direction that would sort of support some of this that you're familiar with.
Yes. The American Psychological Association does a plethora of resources around this. And so you could easily go to www.psychologytoday.com, and there's I want to say hundreds of journal articles that they've listed on this. Go to psychologytoday.com, and in the search engine, type in this. It was actually produced by the American Psychological Association. And so they will redirect you to tons of published articles on this.
Thank you.
No problem. So we also want to highlight, last but not least, what are other types of spiritual care strategies we can highlight during this time? In addition to promoting solid, sound, ethical, appropriate theology, in addition to meeting the social needs of persons, such as the needs around food insecurity, in addition to making psychological long-term counseling referrals for people to address their emotional needs, we also want to invite you to keep in mind these various types of spiritual care interventions, particularly during a pandemic. Particularly during a pandemic. Wonder if you can see this. Let me try sharing this again. I direct persons to this phenomenal book. I love this book. This is like the Bible of disaster spiritual care. And so I invite you to add this book to your library as one of your major resources. And the particular authors of this book suggest that particular strategies you want to lift up. One moment. During this time, from this particular resource, are these key principles of disaster spiritual care. These are the things that we say are the do's and don'ts of providing spiritual care during a pandemic. One, making sure that all basic needs come first. Two, making sure that you do no harm. Three, making sure that each person you work with, you understand, you experience them, you accept that they are unique and holy. Next, it is so important that you do not proselytize, evangelize, or exploit, or take advantage of those affected by a disaster, and don't allow others to do so. Respect the spiritual, religious, and cultural diversity of those you are working with. If you don't know something, ask questions. Presence, meet people where they are, wherever they are in their own spiritual and religious journey. Begin to process with victims and survivors their story. Be aware of confidentiality. Support good confidentiality. Oh, never make a promise. Be sensitive to the ways in which grief looks different for everybody. Also, be sensitive to various language barriers that exist between amongst various persons. Remember the impact of immigration issues and concerns. Immigration is a hot topic for our Latinx brothers and sisters, for example. And so how do we become sensitive to immigration issues in light of COVID-19? And last but not least, practice active listening. Practice active listening. Another resource that I'm going to quickly turn your attention to as we wrap up our presentation today is by a woman by the name of Dr. Naomi Paget. I'm sorry that's a little small there, but she has this wonderful resource. You can Google this. It's available free online. She just released a free online version. It's called Ministry During Pandemic, From Awareness to Implementation. Ministry During Pandemic, From Awareness to Implementation. And she says that these are important steps that you want to highlight and remember in the practice of spiritual care. I'll let you briefly peruse those. Last but not least, if you've enjoyed much of what I've shared today, then please again know that everything I shared was under copyright in my current book. So I'm going to invite you to buy my book, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore. Also available at my publishing company, wifandstock.com. That is my book. So I invite you to go ahead and buy it for more information about the resources that I share and the basic types of important needs I say are important to highlight in spiritual care. I'm going to stop and end our presentation now and say for our last few minutes, let's jump into some Q&A. I'll invite you to just unmute your mic and feel free to jump in.
So many great takeaways, Danielle, but in that list of kind of being with people, that basic needs really, stood out for me when I talk with clergy, and then not making promises and really actively listening. I think three things that I think, at least for like the basic needs and listening, things I think we do, but in crisis, I think, and when people are in these situations, it's really hard not to want to kind of fix and to meet people where they are, to really companion them. So I think those are really important points. So thank you.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you so much for such an empowering session. Learned a lot. I appreciate it, and much success with your book. I will purchase it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm kind of surprised at how much you were able to get into this 1 hour or whatever it is that we've been talking here, and I'm very pleased to have been here, and I thank you very much for your presentation. But I also realized that becoming aware is not enough. And if I let my beliefs do my walking and become my hands, and I need to get things going. I have a church that is very active, and I totally appreciate what they do. But no matter what we do, it doesn't seem to be adequate. And so there's that feeling of there's always more that's needed.
Most definitely.
And I've volunteered at a homeless shelter here in the Elgin area, and it's a part of the spiritual pattern of the Wayside Cross Ministry in Aurora, and so I see both sides of that. Plus, I run groups, facilitate groups for men at my church, and I've been involved in the caring ministry since about 1996. And all that means is that I'm able to do a little bit. I know where the soup kitchens are in the Elgin area, and I know where they are in Kane County, and I know where the homeless shelters are, and I know, having been a case manager there for about 3 years in one of them, I realize the extent of the difficulty that we're facing with this added virus situation. So it's multifaceted. It's biopsychosocial, spiritual. It has all kinds of value-laden discussions that we need to continue having, and that people find what is good and kind in themselves and go practice that.
You hit the nail on the head. Yes. Yes, Bill. Yes. Thank you. I concur with everything you said.
I need that affirmation.
Excuse me, would you be able to speak a little more to specific strategies that we can use to help people as they go through this difficult spiritual time? I'm looking for robust ways to live into God's presence with us. I was just on a call with some women this morning, all women of very deep faith. We pray together every week, and each one of us had a sense of, if God is with us, then why the hell isn't he doing anything? So I think that's where a lot of people are now. A lot of things are bubbling up in all kinds of different ways during this pandemic. And I think we have people in really deep spiritual crisis, as well as the emotional and physical crises. So I'm wondering what kinds of and I'm working in a Christian context where I know my people, so I'm allowed to use that kind of faith language. But I'm wondering, from your experience, what kinds of questions and tools might be employed in this particular situation.
To be honest, that's my entire presentation this morning. Now you're asking me to move into my CPE supervisor background. I believe that the reason people are having spiritual crisis is because, one, there's bad theology that has been iterated to them. And so one strategy is the first strategy I highlighted, that we must remind people that God is with them during this time, and we must reject bad theology and invite people to push back and resist internalizing bad theology.
So my people are getting good theology. So what I want to know is, how do we
Great.
deepen that? I want to glom onto that second part. How do we deepen that sense of God's presence in a time when it's very difficult to detect?
So number
I'm
two,
sure you have wonderful ideas for that.
So number two, I also believe that a second reason why people are in spiritual crisis is seeing the devastation of social needs not being met in larger communities today. And so one way that we can increase people's sense of spirituality and faith is by getting people active in social justice advocacy. Number three, I also believe the reason people experience spiritual crises is because there are deep-seated psychological and emotional needs that people wrestle with. And so how do we get people to now go to therapy and see psychologists and see psychiatrists? And then number four, I think that people wrestle with deep-centered spiritual crisis because we as a church are not lifting up specific spiritual care strategies to those persons. And so that's why I shared those specific strategies from disaster spiritual care. Let me name for you a dynamic. The model that I am proposing is that we are not disconnected beings. Our spirituality is not disconnected from our physical, social, emotional being. This is a holistic care approach, which suggests that the reasons people are wondering where is God is because people are hungry. The reason people are wondering where is God is because so much bad theology has been told to them by the church. The reason people are wondering where is God is because they're actually having psychological mental health breakdowns. The reason people are wondering where is God is because they want to do something. They want to participate in social justice advocacy to contribute to the work. And so I presuppose that holistic care is what's needed. We need more than reading the Bible and talking about God and faith. We need more than simply talking about going to church and having quote unquote spiritual conversations, because that's not meeting the holistic needs of persons. And so I don't separate any of these pieces. I believe that all of these pieces contribute to the holistic entity or being of a person. I don't separate these pieces. I believe these pieces are interconnected. I believe the reason people are having deep-seated spiritual issues and spiritual concerns is because social needs are not being met, emotional needs are not being met, social justice and advocacy is not being met. It's no worries. Just feel free to watch this video over again. No worries. And so I also want to share with everyone, this is my spiritual care model that I'm proposing. Oftentimes we have disconnected these beings and pieces and parts. And I believe this is why we find ourselves in places where people are struggling spiritually in deep-seated ways, because we've tried to say, okay, our job is just to minister to this. Meanwhile, we have people who are hurting in all these other ways that we want to be blind to or don't want to address or feel like that's outside of the scope of our practice. And I'm saying to provide spiritual care means encompassing a holistic approach, because we are all complex beings that are wrestling with issues or concerns that impact the other parts and beings of the self, if that makes sense. That's one of the things I loved about Jesus in Christian community, in Christian circles. Before Jesus talked about anything related to the kingdom of heaven, he realized people was hungry. And so he took 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread and fed folks first before he starts talking about the kingdom of heaven. That's what I love about the Christian ministry of Jesus. That's what I love about the Muslim faith. Before Allah talks about anything related to eternity, there is a need to talk about what is going on in terms of social justice needs in the here and now with people. And so I'm going to invite you to think about, how do we understand caring for folks as a holistic practice and approach, rather than separating parts or beings of the self.
May I add one comment into that? That sometimes I think that the factors that you've been mentioning stand in the way of their understanding the importance of God's Spirit being inside them. They can't experience that to the great degree because these other things operate as almost a barrier. And so once we begin to open that conversation and speak into that story, we have a chance to provide comfort and to provide soothing to a person who's experiencing a rough day, and it gives them a chance to reconnect to this Lord of all that we are all familiar with.
I also say that I think change is inevitable.
Yes.
But it also needs to be expressed in some kind of way. So self-diagnosis is important. And once we can do that, which takes some time, change will come. But I'd rather, work with me first. That way, if they see a change in me, perhaps they could help see a change in themselves, and we can talk about it. But a lot of times people are afraid to discuss it because they have iffy feelings about it. So I just pray that we learn how to change and ask God to steer us in that direction without going off.
I don't think people will respond well unless they feel that they are in a safe place. That, to me, has been important in the groups that I've run.
Oh, yeah.
And if there's no confidentiality, and if there's no ability to, talk about whether or not you like pineapple on your pizza or something that'll break the ice so we can get a conversation flowing so that people can flow into it.
Thank you so much.
choices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over back to Amy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.